There is an 11-metre rudder post in a storage facility near Nanjing that most visitors to the city will never see. It was pulled from the earth in 1957 during excavations at the Longjiang shipyard, and it is the largest wooden ship component ever recovered anywhere in the world. I went looking for it because I was researching something else entirely, a footnote about Ming Dynasty porcelain exports that did not add up. But when I saw the photographs of that rudder post, I stopped. Because a rudder that size does not belong to any ship in the European historical record. It belongs to a vessel so large that nothing comparable would sail again for 400 years. And the civilization that built it did not lose it in a storm or a war. They burned it. They burned the ship, and then they burned the records that proved the ship had ever existed, and then they made it a crime to build anything like it again. I need to explain how that happened, because the implications have not gone away. I found the rudder post because I was looking for something else entirely, but once I started pulling at the thread, the scale of what emerged made the porcelain question irrelevant. What I found was a naval program so vast that it makes every European maritime achievement of the same century look like a coastal expedition by comparison. And I want to lay it out properly, because the facts alone are difficult enough to absorb without embellishment. The story begins with a boy named Ma He, captured in 1381 during the Ming conquest of Yunnan province. He was 10 years old. He was castrated, as was standard practice for war captives designated for palace service, and he was placed in the household of Zhu Di, the Prince of Yan. That detail matters. Zhu Di was not yet emperor. He was a regional military commander with ambitions that would later plunge China into civil war. And the boy he acquired as a servant would become the most consequential admiral in Chinese history. Zhu Di seized the throne in 1402 through a brutal campaign against his own nephew, the Jianwen Emperor. His legitimacy was contested from the first day. The Confucian scholar class regarded him as a usurper. The southern provinces had supported his predecessor. He needed to demonstrate power on a scale that could not be questioned, and he needed to do it quickly. So in 1403, he commissioned a fleet. The construction program was centered at the Longjiang and treasure shipyards near Nanjing on the banks of the Qinhuai River. I have been trying to find reliable estimates of the workforce, and the figure that appears most consistently across the Chinese sources is 10,000 craftsmen at the Longjiang yard alone. They built ships from Fujian cedar and teak, sealed the hulls with tung oil and lime, fitted them with watertight compartments that European shipbuilders would not develop for another 3 centuries. The largest vessels, the treasure ships, were reportedly over 120 meters long, though I want to note that the exact dimensions remain debated among maritime archaeologists. What is not debated is the scale of the fleet itself. Ma He, now renamed Zheng He by the emperor, departed on the first voyage on the 11th of July, 1405. He commanded 62 treasure ships and a combined fleet of up to 300 vessels carrying approximately 27,800 men. To put that in perspective, Columbus sailed with 3 ships and 90 crew. His entire expedition would have fitted inside a single treasure ship. The Ming Navy at its peak totaled 3,500 vessels. No European state would match that number for 2 centuries. 7 voyages followed between 1405 and 1433, reaching Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, the Horn of Africa, and possibly further. Zheng He's fleets carried silk, porcelain, and tea. They returned with tribute, ambassadors, and in one famous instance a giraffe, which the court interpreted as a qilin, a mythical beast whose appearance confirmed the emperor's divine mandate. 18 states sent tribute missions to the Ming court during this period. The Indian Ocean was, briefly, a Chinese lake. 7 voyages, 28 years, 18 states sending tribute to the Ming court, and then it stopped. Not because the ships failed, Not because the crews mutinied, it stopped because someone decided it should. Here is where the history becomes something other than remarkable. Here is where it becomes disturbing. The Yongle Emperor died in 1424 during a military campaign. His successors were weaker, more dependent on the Confucian bureaucratic class that had always viewed the voyages with suspicion. A final voyage was permitted in 1431, largely through the influence of the eunuch faction at court. When Zheng He died during that voyage, in 1433, the political protection the fleet had enjoyed died with him. What kind of civilization, at the height of its power, chooses to unmake its greatest achievement? That is the question I kept encountering in the sources, phrased in different ways by different scholars, and none of the answers I found were satisfying. The official record does not merely end, it is made to end. And the method tells you everything about who held the knife. The destruction of the treasure fleet was not a single dramatic act. It was a sequence of administrative decisions spread across decades, each one framed in the language of fiscal responsibility and Confucian propriety. I want to walk through them carefully, because the mechanism matters more than the outcome. The Confucian scholar officials opposed the voyages on 3 grounds, and I have checked these against multiple translations of the original memorials. The first was political. The voyages were a eunuch project, and the eunuchs were the bureaucracy's rivals for imperial favour. Every tael of silver spent on the fleet was a tael not spent on projects the literati controlled. The second was fiscal. The voyages were expensive. The tribute trade brought exotic goods, but not the kind of revenue that funded border defence against the Mongols, which the scholars regarded as the real strategic priority. The third was ideological, and this is the one I find most revealing. The Confucian worldview held that China was the centre of civilization. The emperor's virtue, not his ships, was what drew foreign states into proper relationship. Sailing out to them implied that they needed to be courted, which undermined the very concept of the tributary system. I am paraphrasing from the memorials because the originals are difficult to access, and translations of this period are contested. But the thrust is consistent across every source I have found. The scholars did not merely want the voyages to stop, they wanted the capacity to resume them destroyed. The traditional account names Liu Daxia, a senior official in the War Ministry, as the man who destroyed or concealed Zheng He's navigational charts and voyage records sometime in the late 15th century. The story appears in multiple Ming dynasty sources, though the exact date and circumstances vary. What matters is the result. The most detailed navigational records of the Indian Ocean, compiled over 3 decades of systematic exploration, were removed from the archive. If the purpose was merely fiscal prudence, why destroy the charts? That question has no comfortable answer, and I have not found a scholar who has provided one. Now I want to go back to the Longjiang yard, because the institutional history, as important as it is, does not capture what was actually lost. I have been reading the accounts of Ma Huan and Gong Zhen, 2 of the chroniclers who sailed with the treasure fleet, and what they describe is a world of extraordinary material skill. The shipyard smelled of tung oil and pine tar. The sailcloth was silk, not canvas. The iron fittings were forged on site. The craftsmen were overwhelmingly from Fujian province, families who had built ships for generations, and I want to describe one of them, a composite figure drawn from what the archaeological record and the voyage accounts tell us about who these men were. He is a master shipwright, perhaps 40 years old at the height of the programme. He shapes tung-wood hulls with tools his father used before him. He fits the watertight bulkheads that allow a treasure ship to survive damage that would sink any European vessel of the same era. He understands the balance of a rudder against a deep keel in open ocean swells. His knowledge is not written down. It lives in his hands and in the oral traditions of his community. And it is precisely this kind of knowledge that is most vulnerable to the method of erasure the scholars chose. The edicts came in stages. By 1474, the navy had shrunk to roughly 1/3 of its former strength. By 1503, it was 1/10. In 1500, the court issued a decree making it a capital offence to build a ship with more than 2 masts. I want to be precise about that. Not a fine, not imprisonment, execution. In 1525, the order came to destroy all remaining ocean-going vessels, and the High Jin, the sea ban, was reinforced again in 1551, by which time there was almost nothing left to ban. The shipwright's yard is closed. His sons, who would have inherited his craft, who would have learned to read the grain of Fujian cedar and to calculate the displacement of a hull by eye, are reassigned to haul grain on the Grand Canal. The dynasty still needs labour. It simply no longer needs the kind of labour that crosses oceans. The tung oil dries in its jar. The tools rust. Within a single generation, the knowledge of how to build the largest ships in human history passes out of living memory. Go back to the Longjiang yard. Go back to the man who shaped the keel. I keep thinking about his hands. They are the hands of someone who could build a vessel capable of crossing the Indian Ocean and returning, a vessel with watertight compartments, a balanced rudder, a hull designed for deep water. Those hands are idle now. The yard where he worked is overgrown. The slipways where treasure ships were launched have been repurposed for fishing boats that are not permitted to sail beyond the river mouth. And here is what the institutional history does not tell you, what I had to piece together from provincial records and coastal gazetteers. The communities displaced by the sea ban did not simply accept reassignment. Many of them turned to smuggling and piracy, becoming precisely the maritime threat the ban was supposed to prevent. The policy created its own justification. The more it failed, the more necessary it appeared. I found references in the Fujian provincial records to families who had worked the Longjiang yard petitioning for the right to resume coastal fishing decades after the ban. Some of those petitions survive. They are written in the formal language of supplication, but what they describe is poverty. Skilled craftsmen reduced to subsistence labour, living in communities that had been deliberately moved inland, away from the coast, away from the water that had defined their lives for centuries. The image that stays with me is not the burning of the fleet. It is the silence afterward. A pair of hands that shaped hulls for the largest ships in history and then shaped nothing at all. The question I keep returning to is not why they burned the fleet. It is how easily the burning was made to look like common sense. When Vasco da Gama reached Calicut in 1498, he arrived at a port. Zheng He's fleet had visited 90 years earlier with 60 ships to da Gama's 4. The European age of maritime supremacy did not begin because Europeans were bolder or more capable. It began because the one civilization that could have contested them on the open ocean chose to erase itself from the sea. The vacuum was not natural. It was manufactured by men who believed they were being practical. How many times has the choice to forget been dressed up as the choice to be responsible? The pattern is not confined to the 15th century. It repeats wherever knowledge is held by communities that lack political protection, wherever skill is treated as a budget line rather than a civilizational inheritance. The mechanism is not a bonfire. It is a requisition order. It is a yard quietly defunded. It is a skill quietly allowed to die. And by the time anyone thinks to look for what was lost, the people who knew are gone, and the rudder post in the storage facility near Nanjing is all that remains to prove they were ever there at all.